improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of the Carry On Podcast, SITREP edition for the week of January 29th. We are almost out of dry January, and I got the memo super late, so I am going to begin my dry January tomorrow morning, I promise. In the meantime, I am enjoying a martini. Vodka is my choice of ingredient for martinis, and as far as specific brand of vodka, this is Kettle One. I am not as deep a bench when it comes to my vodkas as I am to my brown liquor. So if you have a favorite and I don't mention it, please forgive me. I am happy with what I have. And as far as the constitution of a martini, I like to taste my vermouth, but I don't like to drink it, if that makes sense. All right, enough about spirits. Let's move into current events. And there are many to choose from for tonight's discussion. Let's dip our feet back into the Iranian pool. The water is extremely warm, considering it is the Gulf, but also because of the tensions surrounding that region. In case you have not been keeping track, the administration has deployed a carrier group to that part of the world and is following it up with a few other surface vessels as well. Now, carrier group is no joke. It is the epitome of U.S. force projection in the modern era. An aircraft carrier like what is currently off the shores is capable of sorting up to 80, 85 aircraft, a variety of capabilities. And then you have a huge number of enabling surface and subsurface vessels to help out, all capable of firing a variety of surface-to-surface, surface-to-air, ship-to-ship missiles. So not to be trifled with. The cost associated with wielding a carrier group is exorbitant and truly relegated to a first world power. There's not that many navies that are currently deploying aircraft carriers. The United Kingdom has one, if I'm not mistaken, and it's truly more of a jump style aircraft carrier. Russia, yeah, barely. And of course, China. But a discussion for another time. The point is there is force being projected in anticipation of the regime doing something, honestly, that the administration doesn't like. It's somewhat amorphous what that red line is. There's been a lot of discussion about whether protesters being killed would be enough to draw U.S. ire kinetically against the regime. And the narrative is kind of switched. If you followed, it had been crossed this line of, protesters being killed, people incarcerated, being hung and executed, to now really nuclear. It's de-escalation. It's, we want that nuclear program that you were pursuing to be neutered. And if you don't, well, we're going to take action. So it has shifted a little bit. I got to confess, I have become somewhat laser focused on Iran as of late, fairly consistently since Israel and the United States launched attacks last summer into the country of Iran to try and take out their nuclear program. I have more and more engaged in research and thought experimentation on how does this regime change? What would we do to enable change? What does change look like? How would it, no kidding, hour by hour, day by day, how would it unfold? What would be the first domino to tip indicating that something was taking place? And then, following that sequence. And of course, full confession, it is exacerbated by that amazing show on Apple Plus, Tehran. If you're not an Apple Plus subscriber, this is not an endorsement for it, but there's a show that had been produced and directed in Israel about a Mossad agent inside Tehran. Great show. It's just addictive, and I've enjoyed watching it. I think, honestly, it's probably nurtured my interest in this in parallel with current events. So understand that regime change, it's not just a single event. It is not set up, that country is not set up and established and built to be able to swap out one for another, and then suddenly the sun shines and things are brighter. There needs to be a whole sequence of things that take place because of just the way that it's built. There has to be a breakdown of legitimacy followed by a fracture of either real or perceived power. And then that gives way to bargaining and fracturing inside the senior elites, like rats leaving a sinking ship. And it ends with the formation of a new government. And then in the background of that, you have this IRGC, which needs to be addressed. And the Islamic Republic, it's really engineered from the ground up since the revolution to survive mass dissents like what's taken place, unless and until the coercive apparatus splits. And that's your IRGC, your militia groups, your enforcement wing. I mean, any authoritative regime needs an authority arm. It needs an enforcement arm. So it's not a simple thing. Right now, Iran is really recovering from these large-scale protests and an extremely lethal crackdown by the government on those protests. I mean, the last numbers that I've been looking at, they range so dramatically, but, internal documents from the Iranian government have said at minimum 5,000. Independent sources, UK, American, and other countries have said it could be as high as 30,000 dead with another, 15,000 wounded. That's a pretty serious crackdown. And a country of Iran, we're not talking something like the United States or, they don't have the millions. So when you look at percentages of death overlaid with the timeline that the protests took place and the fact that they're not armed, it's a lot. That's a pretty robust crackdown. So they're still internally trying to pick up the pieces from that. There has been calls for an internal investigation, which is shocking. I just struggle to think that the regime would actually have the self-awareness to ask what happened and how did we get here? So they're doing all of this in the context of an increased Western sanctions. Today, as a matter of fact, the EU just labeled the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Formal designation. So that took place earlier today. So when you look at regime change, there's a couple different ways that it could take place. It could be a top-down, a bottom-up, or externally forced, all of which can overcome the regime vis-a-vis the IRGC. And as I mentioned, you need to think about Iran as more than just a president and a parliament. It's a layered theocratic republic with an armed parallel state. We talked about this in some previous episodes where we've kind of unpacked the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, how they control a large portion of the Iranian economy, as well as the intelligence, as well as the enforcement arm. So they are a parallel state. If there is any definition of a deep state, that is definitely it. So you have the supreme leader. Supreme leader's job is to essentially control security, judiciary, state broadcasting, and also key appointments. The supreme leader is the religious, theocratic poster child of the regime. It currently is being occupied by somebody well into their 80s. And there's a lot of rumors only at this point that he is of failing health. I mean, may not survive much longer. Then you have the IRGC and the Baji, which is a paramilitary militia organization, essentially state police, enforcement, a lot of internal policing. It's You think about what took place during the Soviet Union of World War II, and you have a lot of party officials embedded into military units. The Baj it kind of does the same thing in that respect. Internal suppression, deep economic penetration, widely treated as the regime's backbone in many cases, at least as far as the IRGC is concerned. The Bougie is responsible for a lot of the enforcement of the crackdown that took place, but they also took some losses, not many. I think what I read was somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 dead during the protests over the last couple of months. And they also had some episodes of desertion and refusing orders. So I don't know what that foreshadows. You have a guardian council, which is the vetting system. They contain and constrain electoral pathways. They screen candidates, and they can veto legislation. It's kind of like a parliament, but they have a little bit more authority than most of the traditional parliament layouts that you and I would be familiar with. You have the regular military. The regular military is more national than ideological. It is not a conscription army, but it is mandatory for the most part. They are the key variable in any transition because they're not the internal shock troops that the IRGC are, or the Bougie. I am not pronouncing that very well tonight. I promise you, it's my first martini. There is a wild card element with the regular military because in any regime change, regardless of whether it's inside, outside, top down, bottom up, there's very little that I have read or researched that indicates where their loyalties will lie. I would be probably of the opinion that they are going to follow whatever the popular opinion is because they are not ideologues. There is no deeply embedded financial incentive for them to maintain the status quo. So I sense that they'll probably go along to get along, but there you go. So the bottom line is street pressure alone is not going to change this regime. There has to be a fracture at the top. There has to be security defections, or at the very least, there has to be succession at the top. And there's a couple of different paths that regime change can take. There's a couple of different ways that this thing could flesh out. For starters, we could have a palace coup. And that is probably the least impactful, the smoothest. That is essentially, it's the same system that we currently have. It's just a new person at the top. So you could ostensibly have a very small circle of clerical elites that replace Khomeini that's currently declares reform and keeps the coercive spine intact, i.e. the IRGC and the militia police. And this scenario, as I mentioned, is the most orderly. It maintains the status quo. It doesn't fracture internally the Iranian government, security forces. And this one becomes the easiest geopolitically because there's continuity on the nuclear posture. There's continuity on the proxy strategy. And the IRGC's incentives don't disappear with a new leader. So you're not talking about some of the global disruptions that some of the other scenarios present, such as oil prices or threats to shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, things of that nature. So it's, yeah, I mean, that's one. The other one that is a potential is a negotiated transition. You could have a broad coalition of elites and a partial security buy-in that could force a credible opposition coalition inside with help from the diaspora outside the rest of the world in Iran. And they could make a deal with a portion of the security structure to prevent violence, to prevent a power vacuum to prevent a breakdown of order and a potential free fall. In conjunction with this, I think one of the things the United States could possibly do to assist is you dangle sanctions, removal of sanctions, loosening of sanctions, relaxing of sanctions as a carrot in conjunction with the stick that's currently parked off the coast of Iran. That would definitely incentivize a lot of changes if there was a broad coalition internally ready to displace the current leadership. And there's been no indicators of that. So it's one of the options. I don't know how it would manifest itself in real time because there's just too many variables. And the consequences of something like this are at least a reduction in regional escalation. But it's so hard to do because the opposition to this is so entrenched. There's no trust, and the ecosystem of that regime is really structurally designed to avoid it. It's a coup with a bigger package, if that makes more sense. Of course, the last one is a complete regime collapse and then a scramble for power. This one is the worst scenario of all of them because there's this dangerous period where there's an unmanaged redistribution of power. The regime falls, massive vacuum, and the consequences of that vacuum are where are the nuclear sites, where are the missile forces, who has control, who's managing the borders, who's managing the militias, and everybody pretty much just waits for the other shoe to drop. I don't see this one taking place. This is pretty extreme. This would be, there are no other options for the regime. It completely collapses. Elite cohesion breaks at the top. The state's command structure completely fractures. I think that this would be incepted only by a massive economic collapse, worse than it is now, where the sanctions were so tight that we cut off all vectors of revenue for the IRGC, for the regime itself. And it fractures, and it fractures massively. So yeah, I don't see that one happening either, but it is another scenario, and we're just going to go through them all. There is a fourth scenario, and that is external. If we have strikes, not just from the United States, but maybe with some of our partners. And man, I got to say at this point, just to digress briefly, our list of partners in this little endeavor are shrinking by the week. The United Kingdom recently released a story that stated they are not going to participate in any kinetic strikes against Iran. But what they are willing to do is to help defend Iran's counterattack. And I got to say, I don't necessarily blame them. A lot of the Middle East countries are doing the same thing. They're not allowing us to launch airstrikes from Middle Eastern countries so that they remain insulated from Iranian attacks. And yeah, I get it. They have their own countries and their own sovereignties to look after. So yeah. In this external attack scenario, there is a possibility of a strike strengthening the regime. I have previously said that reporting on the ground indicates that the Iranian on the streets position is that external attacks on the regime won't necessarily cause rallying to the flag. But we don't know what that's going to do to the hardliners. We don't know what it's going to do to maximize and encourage repression. It could very well have a paradoxical effect where we're talking about regime change, and then kinetic pressure, it reduces the odds of regime change in the near term, and it could increase regional war risk. So I personally still cling to the belief that you can facilitate regime change by truly attacking Iran's center of gravity. And I am 100% convinced that the center of gravity is the Islamic Republican Guard Corps. If you cut the head off that snake, I think it's going to die. I do. I am, of course, a minority voice when it comes to this COA, but we won't know because we're not going to be able to try all 4 or 5 scenarios anyway. So the second order effects of any regime change, regardless of how it takes place, there's a few. We have to, again, look at the nuclear risks. They become nonlinear at this point. Even U.S. policy talks about how central enrichment capacity is and how quickly breakout timelines can compress if Tehran chooses. In a transition or collapse scenario, the risk isn't just, does Iran want a bomb? It's who controls the program and the guards. That is something that should worry everybody. You don't know where any of that intellectual property would go, where the materials would go. Is it going to go to North Korea? Is it going to be funneled over to the Russians? Not that they need it as far as the intellectual property goes, but where's that fissile material going to go? Where is the enrichment? Where is the hardware? There's about 11 components that you need to make a ballistic missile with a nuclear payload. Each one of those is highly technical. Each one requires unique components for the most part. Only one or two of them is fissionable and traceable and radiates. The rest of them you can smuggle out, and it looks like pinball parts if you're a Back to the Future fan and you get that reference. So it's something that is definitely at the top of mind for a lot of people. You also have to take into consideration that Iran's proxies are still out there. Weakened though they may be, they're still out there, and any collapse of the regime has a second and third order effect on those Iranian proxies. So whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's insert name here, they all get funding and support from Iran. If those dry up, these proxies are going to go freelance, or they're going to compete for funding and legitimacy elsewhere. Where are those going to be, and who is going to own them? A lot of these organizations take their marching orders from the Iranian command and control. If it's fractured and they're out there on their own, they may just decide to escalate to prove their relevance. And that is something that needs to be taken into consideration when we tabulate all of these second and third order effects. We also have the ever-present energy and maritime security. You've got oil prices that could just ripple. You have the Straits of Hormuz, which could still become very target rich for Iranian reprisals or for just opportunists. If you have fractured Iranian regime who may decide to execute their version of foreign policy directly oppositional to another fractured within Iran, then you have instability, and world markets don't like instability. So we've talked about shipping insurance spikes, oil price shocks. We've talked about shutting down one of the large navigable waterways that is the Strait of Hormuz. So, it's a thing. You have a massive refugee crisis that, of course, would probably fold into this, but I mean, not to be unfeeling, but that's kind of lower down on the scale of severity compared to what happens to nuclear material and all of that. And then who inherits the post-Iran file? What do we do with the sanctions enforcement, the arms transfers, the embargoes, all of the financial sanctions that are taking place. Who takes that over in a post-regime failure of Iran? In practice, at least, the Western diplomatic channels can work at this, especially as terrorism designations expand. But it is an effect that you want to look at when we talk about Iranian regime change. So you've got, just to kind of summarize here, you have a soft continuity, which is the most stable. You have this messy hybrid transition, which is the best outcome, but it's the hardest path. And then a violent fragmentation, which is the worst outcome, but it's not unheard of. We've seen things like that before. For the United States, our biggest worry is always going to be nuclear in its entirety. So preventing loss of control, containing those proxies, avoid getting the regime a nationalist trigger. We don't want to gift them this as an excuse. And then we have to prepare for refugees and humanitarian spillover. I like the fact that many countries are keeping diplomatic lanes open, even while the United States is continuing to escalate. And I don't say escalate pejoratively. I am not 100% opposed to the big stick approach. I'm simply saying that there are a lot of countries, United States amongst them, who are trying to negotiate, who are trying to offer a path to de-escalate. And Iran is also saying that they would like this. They are not saying it in the language that anybody wants to hear. And what I mean by that is they're saying we want, no preconceived conditions. There's no, we'll come to the table, but you have to give up your nuclear aspirations. They want no preconceived conditions for negotiation. And that's, that's a tough pill to swallow when you're trying to really deal with a country that has a history of authoritative, internal and external, who has cried for, not just death to Israel, but death to America, demonstrated their willingness and ability to export violence either directly or through proxy. So, yeah, when they come and say, well, we're willing to negotiate, but no preconceived conditions, and we may walk away from the negotiating table. It's it's hard to take that without a large dose of salt. So that's at least our check-in with Iran. It is no less messy today than it has been. In fact, I would say it's actually worse. I talked a little bit about the U.S., or at least this administration, both Trump's first term and this term. They seem to have a proclivity towards attacking on the weekend. Today is a Thursday evening. You do have a carrier group there. There has been a lot of discussions in the media about the use of force. So we'll see. While most of the eastern seaboard is under a snow warning for Saturday, it is not going to keep fixed-wing strike aircraft from launching off the deck of a carrier at a 2 a.m. strike. So we may be having a very different discussion next week on this topic. But until then, we are going to let that one sit for the moment. And let's transition to a different subject. This one caught my eye early, and I have been looking at it a little over the past 72 hours. So there's been a few articles published by a few different sources, alleged by the Ukrainians and reported by a couple of media outlets about an American company in direct violation of sanctions against Russia, selling components, drone technology to Russia. And for those of you that don't know, there is a federal law called ITAR, which is International Traffic in Arms Regulations. ITAR lists a group, a catalog, if you will, of technologies that are very tightly controlled on the export market. So if you're a U.S. aerospace company and you make military-related technologies, or you do services, or you possess technical data, the Department of State controls who you can sell that to outside of the borders of the United States. And there's a lot of technology that falls under ITAR regulations. Night vision and thermal are some of the biggest. Weapon systems, you would be shocked to realize, or maybe you wouldn't, how little weapon systems are controlled by ITAR. They are, but for the most part, the United States really doesn't care who ends up with a weapon. What they care about is somebody ending up with advanced night vision, thermal, technical data on large platforms, things like that. ITAR has been around for a very, very long time. And there's a lot of subsections to ITAR regulations. It's a bit redundant. Sorry, it's just ITAR. It wouldn't be International Traffic in Arms Regulations, but the acronym. There are United States munitions lists, which annotates who is an authorized user of a lot of the technology that the United States military-industrial complex conceptualizes, manufactures, who you can export it to. The president has control under the law about what country is on that list. Congress does have, certain muscles they can flex, but I don't want to go down the wonky rabbit hole. Let's talk about what happened with this company. So Ubiquity is the name of the company. They're effectively controlled by the CEO. His name is Robert Pera. He owns 93% of the beneficiary ownership, according to an SEC report share that I looked up. So he owns the bulk of the company. So this guy, they are a U.S. company. They do have a subsidiary in Taiwan, which was interesting, I thought. And they're a tech company. And currently they make predominantly drone parts, drone equipment, drone technology. We'll just leave it at that. There is a credible and detailed public allegation currently out there. It's not yet tripped the enforcement, but it is circulating and deemed to be fairly credible that they sold and continue to sell meaningful tech after the 2022 export control sanctions against Russia, which is pretty shitty when you think about it. In addition to selling, they have continued to, through third parties, which we're going to talk about here in just a moment, to provide stuff even after they were basically called on the carpet. And this is a company that has, according to what I've read, a couple of high-profile instances where they have been caught selling to countries that they shouldn't have. Iran, for example, they had 2 violations of selling back in 2016 technology to Iran in direct violation of sanctions that they weren't supposed to. And it's kind of left a lot of people wondering, well, how does this happen? How does something like this take place when the United States has such tight controls on external selling of exporting under ITAR regulations, a lot of this technology? I mean, it's monitored. It's not, it is not like a company as large as Ubiquity, is not being monitored. There's export control. You have to file export paperwork, and it's left a lot of people wondering, how did this take place? How was something like this allowed to take place? Well, their networking equipment for drones was sold through third-party transshipment through people who then repackaged it and sold it again. And it was really enabled by weak end user enforcement. The most complete information, open source right now, is coming from Hunter Brook Media, which I have to caution you, this is a very weird media group because they're not really media group. Hunter Brook Capital, they are they're a capital group. They control funds, they control money, they control investments. It's an investment firm, but they have two arms. The firm uses a media arm which publishes investigative stories, and its capital arms takes positions either long or short based off that research, which is weird. So Hunter Brook Capital disclosed a short position on Ubiquity, and just understand, because of that, their motives are a little mixed. So, try to verify the facts independently. They may be offering up this story, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying they may be to try and make money by shorting the stock. So the evidence that Hunter Brook is publicly citing says that an analysis of trade records shows that Ubiquity has made about $28 million after the invasion. They can trace shipments outside of the United States that have ended up in Russia. They claim some of the shipments lacked identifying information about what they are, concealing the shipper's name, which is a classic way to obfuscate what you're actually exporting when it comes to a lot of these goods that are illicitly finding their way into places that they shouldn't. They are claiming that roughly 26 months after the invasion and the export ban comparison window, that they are still selling products. It doesn't, and this is a nuance that I feel is fair to Ubiquity. It doesn't, just because they have identified this amount of product ending up in Russian production, in Russian consumption, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is recognized revenue for Ubiquity. It is a proxy for market flow. It's captured by intermediaries and resellers. So Ubiquity's take would be whatever the wholesale revenue they got selling to distributors. Legally or not, it depends on your interpretation of what we're about to talk about in this story. But Hunter Brook claims that antennas and radio bridges are appearing in Russian state media clips and battlefield footage, which is demonstrable and confirmable, right? They even cited a thank you letter supplied by a Russian vendor for gear sent to the combat zone. I have to pause here for a second, because if I was the CEO of a company in the United States who is providing, tier one technology on the drone market to global markets, and I got a thank you letter from a Russian vendor for gear sent to the combat zone, stop fucking selling your equipment. It's pretty un-American. Whether you believe in the Russian invasion of Ukraine or not, the United States government has politely told you not to do it. I think that's pretty much hand in the cookie jar proof right there. I don't know. That's just me. I would probably find another market for your products. If they're as good as you say they are, then that market is not the only source of revenue for you, but whatever. Other proof that Hunter Brook is reporting is that they had an undercover group stage as buyers and allegedly found Russian vendors ready to supply known restricted hardware from Ubiquity to them, proving that they were willing to bypass sanctions, ignore sanctions. And And then, of course, a couple of other media outlets have picked up the story. That doesn't necessarily mean that the originating facts are true, but it does mean that other people have independently vetted the source material, found it to at least on the surface hold water, and have further reported it. Yahoo Finance and The Verge are two that come to mind off the top of my head. Really surprised that Yahoo's actually even still in business. And good for them, right? Like, okay. So how is this equipment getting into Russia if they are not supposed to be selling this, if it is on the restricted list, if Russia is sanctioned? Well, it's really simple. All they do is they say that we sold it to a distributor and the distributor's customer re-exported it. And even their Ubiquity's own SEC files makes the structural vulnerability explicit. They have said they have no direct sales force. They sell primarily through distributors and resellers. So they're not responsible for where this equipment ends up. When you have a concentrated distributor model plus an inventory churn, you end up with a limited end user visibility. It matters for diversion risk. Hunter Brook's allegation is that the official distributors and downstream traders kept products moving by routing through Turkey, Kazakhstan, Hong Kong, UAE, a lot of these high diversion risk jurisdictions. And at first blush, a lot of this adds up. This has been going on since World War I. We'll take a look at the historical precedent after we, finish the topical discussion of Ubiquity, because this is not necessarily new. Now, I'm not advocating it. I'm not saying that I support it. I'm just saying this is not exactly a new thing, but it sucks. It sucks either way. I think I've been pretty vocal and public about my outcry and outrage about the Ukrainian country being invaded by its larger neighbor. I'm a huge fan of the underdog. I think that Ukraine should continue to fight into the last breath. I can say that in the comfort of my first world problems. I may have a different tune if I was over there, but, be that as it may, having been in combat in a couple of theaters, yeah, this doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with me about this whole situation. But back to the subject at hand, there are a couple of pathways that this happens. You could directly export it, reroute it for Turkey. You could switch shell companies. You can funnel it. One of the pathways that Hunter Brooks described was Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan acts as a relay. Shipments will allegedly go to a Kazakhstan-linked entity, and then the equipment flows back to Russia under less specific labeling. They basically lie on the customs forms. The shell companies, there's distributors. So Ubiquity sells it to a distributor, which further sells it to a customer, which then lies on the customs forms, lies on the originating, the country of origin, lies about what is actually consisting in the packaging, and it's finding its way into Russian drone production. The importers a lot of times will allegedly source Hong Kong exporters up and until those exporters are designated. If Hong Kong is kind of the technological gateway to the East and has been, it is the huge hub for financial markets, for technology, and it has always operated above board. But just because it has been heretofore above board doesn't mean that they're witting of what this equipment is, where it's come from, the path that it has arrived to them. So there's a couple of different routes, Hong Kong, Kazakhstan, and Turkey being the big one. And here's the ugly truth. Distribution networks, they're not built for scale. Or correction, they are built for scale. They're not built for law enforcement. So if a manufacturer's controls are mostly contractual paper compliance, clauses, reseller warnings, but there's no monitoring, there's no end user checks, there's no diversion analytics, there's no enforcement, then it's basically a money laundering for equipment in this case. There's a lot of third-party transshipments that have been repeatedly flagged as being a Russian evasion method, but no one's enforcing it. You have Interpol to a large extent, the United States domestically, and we do some stuff abroad, but there's ways that the United States companies have been avoiding this kind of stuff for decades. If a U.S. manufacturer sells to a non-Russian distributor, the distributor can later divert unlawfully those goods without the original U.S. manufacturer having any idea what's taking place. And if you have no reason to know, if there's no burden of proof, if the manufacturer caused or assisted the unlawful export, then it's their compliance. It's sort of like they can claim, a U.S. manufacturer can claim ignorance. At least as far as Hunter Brook's narrative is concerned, they claim that all of these drone components have gone through Turkey, UAE, Central Asia, and Hong Kong by relabeling or mislabeling goods and customs paperwork, using shell traders and constantly rotating those. And then they just flat out omit the brands, the origin brands, and the originator fields in the customs documents. Hunter Brook is also saying that a lot of these intermediaries were later sanctioned. Great. But authorities always sanction the middleman first, and then they work upstream if evidence supports it. So while they may very well have sanctioned those shell companies, those distributors, those middlemen, they're not doing anything about ubiquity. I don't expect anyone to clutch their pearls and feign outrage and start marching down to Ubiquity's corporate headquarters, but fuck, man, this is pretty cut and dry as far as I'm concerned. You made $28 million over the post-invasion window selling drone components to a country that invaded their neighbor. You're not supposed to. I mean, legally, you're not supposed to, but like, fuck, man, ethically. Yeah, all right. So there are organizations whose sole charter is to enforce this. Whether the article has legal framework is not for me to decide, and I certainly don't want to be hypocritical when I champion the critical thinking that is required of all of us to look at this issue. But Ubiquity is not offering any counters to this. If you look at their track record, as I said, you had, it was March of 2014, not 16, as I had previously stated. They settled a $500,000 fine. They were found guilty of apparent Iranian trade sanctions violations. They also were charged by OFAC regarding exports that have later fallen into Iranian hands by third parties. So there's a pattern here. And Ubiquity is not offering any proof to the contrary. So it seems pretty simple to me. You have a company that makes products in the United States. You have video footage of said product ending up on the battlefield in Russian hands. You have a letter of thanks by a Russian distributor for those products saying that they were ending up on the battlefield. Now, could the letter have been contrived? Sure, I suppose it could have, but the Ukrainians have physical evidence, broken drone pieces on their soil that are from Ubiquity's manufacturing plant. That one's pretty hard to refute. It's ugly business. And unfortunately, they're not the only. If you look at the last century, there has been a ton of this stuff. You have strong motivators for it. I hate to say it, but I'm a huge fan of the capitalist system. I think that a free market society is the best that the human race has found to enable creativity, inventiveness, to celebrate the success of the individual. But it has an ugly side, and this is definitely one of them. If you go back to World War I, 1917 was the first law, the Trading with the Enemy Act, that was enacted by the president to restrict trade with enemies and manage and confiscate enemy property. Now, later that morphed into, in the 70s, into the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's a mouthful. But it's essentially two sides of the same coin. You have the TWEA, which is, think of it as more of a wartime, and then you have the IEEPA, which acts as a cornerstone of modern U.S. sanctionings, like trade prohibitions, asset freezing, and then recently tariff imposition. So it doesn't have to be war. It can be a national emergency, and an international emergency is something that's declared by, the president. So, yeah, this goes way back. We have since World War I tried to restrict intellectual property, and since then there have been ways that companies have tried to circumvent those rules. For example, you had both Ford and GM selling illegally vehicle parts, and use of forced labor in some cases. If you go back and you look at the Ford work and GM's OPE, that's an ugly part of American history. The dual use mechanism is a huge way that we have historically U.S. companies have historically circumvented sanctions. During the Cold War, we were not selling a lot of technology to Russia, Soviet Union as it was known back then, and China. But instead of selling tanks, you sell machine tools, you sell avionics know-how, you sell advanced electronics, you sell satellite integration know-how. And then on paper, it looks like it's for peaceful purposes, but anybody with two brain cells knows that it is for military applications. That took place during the Cold War all over the place. And all the way up to really 1990, you had Hughes and Laurel, Hughes Aircraft Company. There was a congressional report that described unauthorized transfer of technical information to China during launch failure investigations involving Laurel and Hughes. You're not supposed to give that to China. It's post-accident technical assistance, and it's missile-relevant knowledge transfer about guidance, about reliability, about integration. And what did the government do in response? It tightened export control jurisdiction and oversight of satellite technology, but it didn't plug the hole. It was just a temporary stopgap. There's a long line going back from World War II all the way to the present of companies circumventing for-profit restrictions. And this boggles my mind because these are companies that are uniquely American, GM, Ford, selling products and during a wartime posture to our adversaries. And you take it into the modern age, You had Iran, Iraq, and Sudan. This is the most repeatable template. Sanctions exist, but commerce finds a path through finance in third countries. Iraq, for example, during the 1980s, you had dual-use exports. So, you had products that, at least on paper, were supposed to be for civilian end use, but, readily adaptable towards military applications. OFAC settlements show that in the 2000s, all the way up to 2020, you had Iran and Sudan have third-party sanction violations take place. Berkshire Hathaway, Iran-related exposure via a foreign subsidiary. You had Apollo Aviation and Ericsson, services and logistics. There's so many U.S. companies, Coca-Cola, IBM. IBM was producing punch cards for the Nazis. So this is not new, is the point. It is certainly not a proud chapter in American history, but it's a chapter that's not closed or bookended. It's still going on. I would hope that Ubiquity has the moral and ethical fortitude to knock this shit off. What are you doing, bro? There's no dollar amount that's worth this type of ethical violation. And I suppose there is an argument there to be made that any U.S. defense contractor shouldn't be exporting, tools of war, regardless of whether the country is on the naughty or the nice list. But I think that's a little too idealistic for tonight. So let's put that one to bed. Ubiquity, naughty. You're being a dick. Knock it off. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to briefly discuss was the ceasefire that had been, I don't want to say negotiated because that gives it a little too much credence. How about a ceasefire that was strongly and publicly broadcasted? Yeah. So Putin and Trump Trump called Putin and said, do me a favor. I would very much appreciate it if you would stop attacking the capital city of Ukraine, at least for a week, because of the extraordinary cold, and Putin agreed. That is the public side that the Trump administration is putting forth. It has not been corroborated by the Kremlin, but it has been pretty vocally stated. And Zelensky in Ukraine is latching onto it pretty tightly, saying that we expect implementation of this agreement, at least for a week. It is being framed as a de-escalation step. It is supposedly in preparation for a continued peace negotiation that is, I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. I love this. This enthusiasm is great. But if anyone thinks that the Soviets, yep, that's right, I said it. If anyone thinks that the former Soviet Union is going to agree to a ceasefire, is going to agree to a peace treaty, is going to agree to any of the negotiations that are taking place on both sides of the aisle, you're kidding yourself. You're being a useful idiot. It's not going to happen. But at least as far as this story is concerned, the Trump administration is loudly stating that Putin has agreed to a week-long ceasefire due to the damage to the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. But the Kremlin has said nothing about this. And Zelensky is waiting for this to be enforced and signed. But it's Kiev only. It's not all cities. And it's not going to last for more than a week, and it's supposedly just energy infrastructure only. So I don't know. Is it drones? Is it missiles? Is it glide bombs? Is it reciprocal? If you were watching the news, this was amazing. Ukraine just publicly shared video footage of a massive drone strike that targeted 1 billion euros worth of Soviet aircraft. And it's on YouTube. It's on a couple of different channels. It shows first-person video footage of drones striking MiGs. An Antonov is hit. A couple of helicopters are hit. And I'm not going to run down the model numbers because it doesn't matter. But what's beautiful about this is one, the audacity it takes for the Ukrainians to launch drones so deeply into Russian territory. This kind of smacks of the attack that took place a while back where they had hidden drones inside of trucks. These trucks were then parked near air bases. Roof of the truck opens up and all these drones fly out. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's the bottom line. So the video footage shows these drones attacking some of these large cargo planes that the production line has long since shuttered and they can't be replaced. And I think it's good for morale. I think it's good for the Ukrainians to show that they can strike beyond the borders of their own country, especially in such a clever way. So is this ceasefire reciprocal? I don't know. It doesn't say that. I will say that the Ukrainians are probably going to suffer for the next 3 weeks until the weather warms up a little bit. I don't think that the Kremlin is going to adhere to this ceasefire. I don't think that it is going to be a temporary pause. I just don't. It's humanitarian on the surface, but it has a lot of diplomatic management as a side effect. It lets Moscow appear reasonable while also conceding their core objectives. The real question, though, is the pause, is this a pause in capability or is this a pause in intent? I don't know. I think that, as I've said time and time again, I think that the negotiations that are taking place on the Russian side is not in good faith. I think to think otherwise is extraordinarily naive. Shame on you. Yeah. But I want to mention it. I think that any attempt to bring Russia to the negotiating table needs to be broadcast. I think we need to hold their feet to the fire. I think that what the Russian government wants is a free pass. They want legitimacy. They want to be seen as this is a just conflict and that their impetus for starting this is legal, moral, ethical, and I don't think any of the above is true. So we'll continue to follow up on that. I would not hold my breath, but moving on to another ethical and legal topic. This is one that I have been hesitant to speak about, to weigh in on, for a whole host of reasons. You know, for starters, I don't typically like to weigh in on domestics. Not if I can help it, simply because there are so many outlets and agencies that cover domestic issues in the United States better than I can do. And truly, the only thing that I offer when weighing in on a domestic issue is my opinion. And while I am flattered that you would think my opinion carries weight, I really want to deal mostly not always, but 80%, 90% is just fact. I like to talk about global events that could potentially shape the landscape of the planet, whether that's cultural, geopolitical, financial, the things that really move society, move the human race. And this is very much an emotionally charged issue, which makes it further challenging to peel back because you have to set aside your preconceived notions. And that's much easier when you talk about foreign events, which are not directly visceral. When you talk about a domestic event, asking you to be critical and objective becomes much more difficult because we all have emotional bias. And that emotional bias lives and breathes inside of our domestic culture. So it seems like I'm dancing around the topic that I'm going to discuss, and I apologize if that's the case. I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork for why I am hesitant to talk about this, but I'm going to do it anyways. And that is Minnesota. All right, there, I said it. Whew. All right, allow me to retrieve one of the garlic stuffed olives from my vodka martini. Thank you for the indulgence. Briny. Okay. I'll stop avoiding. I apologize and thank you for your patience. Okay, so DHS, Department of Homeland Security, which is the overarching government agency that controls ICE and controls CBP. They launched an operation in Minnesota called Metro Surge. This operation blended ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, into a visible street posture, which resulted in 2 U.S. citizens dying. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But since I have learned that we have a bit of an international audience, Renee Good was an ICE-involved shooting, and Alex Pretty was a CBP-involved shooting. Now, after the killings, internal ICE guidance in Minnesota, it shifted. The guidance then became de-escalation by procedure. For example, avoid engaging agitators, use megaphones at distance, narrow your enforcement to immigrants with a criminal nexus, whatever that may be. In addition to that, there was reduced Border Patrol presence, to more of a support role, which is really a tacit admission that the prior posture was creating unacceptable risk. I don't know about that. I kind of struggle with that perception. And what I mean by that is, I assume from the outset noble intent. If you're a law enforcement official, you went into that profession for some type of altruistic reason. Now, it may not be the forefront of why you applied. It may be for something as cut and dry as you needed a job, and that was what you were qualified for. I get it. There's a lot of jobs, though. You could have been a ditch digger, or you could have been a police officer. You chose a police officer. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you did that for altruistic reasons. Okay. Now, that's my going in position. So when publicly moving CBP towards a support role is a tacit admission that what they were doing before was creating unacceptable risk, I don't know about that. I don't want any of us to brand what is taking place in Minnesota or elsewhere with enforcement and immigration as every single ICE officer and every single CBP person is, in the wrong. There's other words that have been used to describe them. I'm not doing that because I don't agree with it. I think it's cowardly. Okay. I'm not even going to say the word that is being used to describe these individuals because I'm not going to perpetrate it. But I want everyone to understand what is the difference between an ICE official and a CBP when it comes to duties and responsibilities and roles. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, interior enforcement, they are built, organized, and trained for arrests, detentions, and removals of illegals in the United States. Don't fucking get into a discussion with me about whether people are illegal or not, okay? In the United States, we have a law, a lot of them. The law says that if you're here without asking permission, your designation is an illegal alien. Fucking deal with it, okay? If you don't like that word because it doesn't make you feel good, that is not my fault. I am not in charge of feelings, and feelings have nothing to do with fact. So moving on. They also do a couple of other things. They do investigations, ERO, HSI, et cetera, et cetera. So that's ICE. Now, CBP comparatively does enforcement at borders and ports. They're optimized for border security and ports of entry with border patrols between ports and CBP officers and OFOs at ports specifically. So that's the difference in roles and responsibilities between an ICE agent and a Customs and Border Patrol or CBP. Now, I've dealt with both. Never had a problem. I've never felt that any of the individuals that I've interacted with officially have been cavalier or cowboys or, at any of the terms that some people think that these people should be branded with. But that's not important. Let's leave that one alone for the moment because that is emotional and I want to stick to facts. So why were the two of these integrated? Why were they overlapped? Why were they both in Minnesota? And why are they still in Minnesota at the same time? Because the legal rules enabling mixing of these two people, it's very broad immigration enforcement. They're both responsible for enforcement authority under the federal law. So Department of Homeland Security, which owns them both, can surge CBP components inland if ICE needs help. Understand that it's not just in Minnesota, but in a lot of the countries, in a lot of the cities that ICE is currently operating in, local law enforcement has refused either internally or externally to support ICE. So when you have a large scale operation, you have to bring in enablers. You have to bring in support. You need more people, and Customs and Border Protection is a federal organization under DHS, trained, manned, and equipped for enforcement actions. They are FLETC graduates. They are federal law enforcement graduates with credentials, and they just makes perfect sense. After the shootings, things changed. They relegated CBP from directly supporting to being upfront to really keeping them from being perceived as frontline urban crowd control force, at least in light of the most recent shooting and pretty shooting. So who was shot and why it matters? It always matters when somebody has loss of life. I'm not cavalier nor macabre about these deaths, and I'm not diminishing it. I'm simply, again, framing it in objective terms. So Reuters reported that an ICE agent shot Good in Minneapolis during the surge. Federal officials claimed self-defense, that she was driving, tried to hit them with the car. The mayor of Minneapolis said that the video contradicts it. I said Minnesota when I first started this broadcast. Maybe I do need a dry January. I apologize. The next person, Alex Pretty, shot on the 24th of January by Customs and Border Protection, excuse me. A preliminary report did not mention Pretty brandishing a firearm. And Reuters reports video showing his gun was actually removed and controlled. The video that I saw shows an officer with the weapon holstered, walking away with it just before shots were fired, which completely contradicts earlier public portrayals, which cast him as an imminent lethal threat. And if you have lethal force attributed to two different DHS components in the same environment, then this is what fuels claims that the surge is unsafe and it's unmanaged. That there's no, grown-up supervision to this. There is a fog of war, and I think that this is something that I want people to understand. When you have a split-second decision by law enforcement, it is very easy to Monday morning quarterback it. It is very easy to immediately rush to a conclusion. What is extraordinarily difficult and something that many people will never have to endure is looking at it from the shooter's standpoint, from the officer's standpoint, from the person that pulled the trigger that resulted in lethal force, frame of mind, perceptions. It is a wonderful thing to be able to sit in the comfort of our living rooms and look at a video 20, 30, 40 times from different angles, a montage of cell phone and security footage and body cam, and say, well, you're a complete fucking idiot. It is another thing entirely to be the one that has none of those tools, that has about 2 seconds to react, and maybe made a decision that is later proven to be the wrong one. But I will tell you from somebody who has been in a life or death situation on multiple occasions that it is never that crisp. It is never that cut and dry. There's always a fog of war. You have tunnel vision, compressed decisions, role confusion in this case between ICE and CBP, marked and unmarked units, mistaken identity, chaotic pursuit dynamics. All of these things contribute towards, the fog of war, something that a lot of veterans know all too well. Reuters reviewed the video. They reviewed the violent encounters. They described repeated divergence between the early official narratives and the later evidence, such as the video and the medical records. Excuse me. Yeah, and I agree. There probably is. And that fog of war does not justify cementing a narrative before evidence exists. And this is why I was so hesitant to weigh in on this issue, because there have been so many people who have been useful idiots and have done nothing more than perpetuate their social media echo chambers about what took place that day. And wait, instead of wait until the facts are in. I have no doubt that there is probably culpability on behalf of these officers. I have no doubt that the facts will bear that out. But don't try these individuals in the court of public opinion because you are outraged at what the underlying mission was that they are executing. Don't do that. That's lazy. That's lazy thinking. I beseech you, I'm asking you, I'm begging you, just wait. The facts will bear themselves out. It does not justify the messaging that leadership gave. That on both sides, there were rushes to judgment. There were opinions given. There was fucking idiotic statements by DHS secretary, FBI, the administration themselves. You have had and are still having legitimate protester violence and hostile acts. Absolutely, 100%. There's credible reporting of street environments, including aggression, interference, enough to shape the use of force narrative. If you are going to conduct a peaceful protest, please see the first word of that statement, peaceful. You do not have, whether you think you are right, wrong, the right to impede law enforcement. That is not the time to die on that hill, because in many cases you will die. Again, not trying to be cavalier. Reuters documents all of this as part of the broader violence encounters landscape around the crackdown and a lot of the narratives that have followed. This street violence, protest, don't have a problem with it, but doesn't give you the right to be violent, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to, when confronting a credentialed law enforcement officer, using use of force. You don't get it. Now, there is some disputes because the facts are amorphous and they are changing in real time. And this is the part of the story that I really find so distasteful. Claims of violence can spread faster than verification. Reuters, for example, has reported instances where claims around the rallies and the incidents were not independently verified at the time. And I think that there has been and will probably continue to be violence in some of these movements. The decisive factor, though, is whether or not commanders on the ground and political leadership translate that reality into proportionate tactics and truthful messaging, or use it as a blanket justification. And then here we go to the crux of this issue, and that is the Second Amendment issue regarding the shooting of Pretty. Almost out the gate, when the individual that was shot, when that story came to light, when it was, it was very public, the official party line from multiple vectors was, well, wait, a gun. He had a gun, and you can't do that. I'm sorry, wait a minute. What do you mean he had a gun? Well, he had a gun in his possession. Okay, was he brandishing the weapon? No. But he brought a gun to a protest, and he shouldn't have done that. That's against the law. Okay, wait a minute. Time out. There's no law in Minnesota that says that you cannot have a firearm at a protest. Senior administration officials, though, are saying that carrying a firearm at a protest is unlawful and inherently disqualifying, both of which are not true. And God bless it, I don't like the fact that we are blending these issues together, because it exacerbates just how confusing this is. FBI Kash Patel immediately goes on in a press release and says, you can't bring a firearm to a protest. And that was echoed by Kristi Noem. Frame the presence of a firearm and magazines as inherently suspicious. And then President Trump himself publicly suggested that Pretty should not have carried a gun. Well, it's a legal event. He is legally allowed to carry it. It is driving a wedge between two groups that heretofore have harmoniously existed, and that is Customs and Border Protection, DHS in its entirety, and Second Amendment advocates. And now they're on opposite ends of this discussion, entirely because you made that statement, and then you ran with it, and then you doubled down and tripled down that this individual should not have had a firearm. Whether or not he should or should not have had that firearm is a completely separate issue from whether or not he was deserving of lethal force. But you're going to muddle the issue now, and you are going to give a hill to die on on a group of people who probably were your greatest supporters, i.e. those that are strong advocates of the Second Amendment. The lawful public carry is a centerpiece of the Second Amendment doctrine. Now, I will digress here for a moment and just offer an opinion, and I am prefacing it as my opinion. I personally find open carry to be less than ideal. And I have not been shy about voicing my opinions as to why I feel this way. First and foremost, you are broadcasting to all of the people who wish to do you harm that you should be the first target that they engage. If I can see that you are the armed individual and I am a threat, I'm going to take you out first. That is not how to be the gray man. Secondly, look, no one is a stronger supporter of the Second Amendment than me. Maybe there are. I'm sure there are. Let me retract that statement. I am a large supporter of the Second Amendment, as I am sure many of you are, but it makes people nervous. Brandishing a firearm on your hip, if you are not military or law enforcement, makes the public at large nervous. It does not instill confidence. It does not reassure people. First and foremost, it makes people twitchy. It just does, man. Deal with it. Better to conceal it. You don't broadcast it to a threat that you are armed, and you don't make the general public at large twitchy. So I am not a huge fan of open carry, but it doesn't fucking matter what I think because it was legal. It was completely legal. And treating lawful carry at protests as illegitimate, it turns the right into conditional permission. And that's the problem that the Second Amendment advocates have in this instance. You can carry until law enforcement doesn't like the setting. It doesn't work that way. The law doesn't work that way. The amendment doesn't work that way. And this is why the backlash is coming from not just Republicans, but liberals, from pro-gun organizations and conservative legal rights commentators. Gun rights groups have challenged the federal narrative that possession of a firearm likely justified deadly force. I don't think that it did. And everyone is comparing Kyle Rittenhouse, to this party line contradiction. And I think for good reason. I think that the law and order forfeiture argument is weak because otherwise this whole thing becomes a rhetorical trapdoor. The government can declare you obstructing and erase your rights after the fact. I think this was most likely a throwaway comment by the FBI director in light of the shooting, DHS included, to try and justify, explain what took place and why, when I think that both of those individuals, as the leaders of their organizations, should have known better. Anytime I have watched any police representative step in front of a camera or the media, their response has always been, I am not going to say anything at this time until the investigation is finished. Any number of ways that is said. And neither one of these individuals did that. They immediately jumped to a conclusion. And then they doubled down on it. And now we're fucked. Because you are going to force an issue that didn't need to be an issue because you did not edit your comments to the press. I don't know how this is going to play out. It's not going to go well. There is no happy ending with this story. There just isn't. This is completely, at least as far as the Second Amendment aspect of this issue is concerned, completely contradicts the GOP party line. It's always been to normalize public carry and resist location-based disqualification logic, saying, in effect, you can't bring a gun to a protest. It's functionally a soft gun-free zone principle. And it's exactly what the GOP has spent years arguing against. this has forced two loyalties in direct collision, and it's produced a very rare and a very public wedge. It is unfortunate that either one of those two individuals are not with us anymore. But I also wasn't there. And I was not the one wielding the weapon. And I'm going to wait until this is adjudicated in a court of law before I become morally outraged over it. Now, if you want to form a personal opinion about whether you think illegal aliens in the United States have a right to be here, by all means, that is a personal and very subjective opinion that all of us under the Constitution and the beautiful, beautiful country that we live in are entitled to espouse. But don't be an echo chamber. Don't check into the social media feeds and then just parrot everything that you hear. Don't do that. You're better than that. All right. I think I have preached quite enough on this issue. See, I told you and I warned you I did not want to talk about domestic issues because they are emotional. And I guess I was not immune to my own advice because I'm emotional about whether or not I should be emotional about this topic. So before we truly end, let's check in with my good friend and producer, Jason Maris, to see if there's any saved rounds. Jason, anything that you would like to probe further?
The Minnesota topic is extremely emotionally charged, and I could say there is reasons for that on both sides. But regardless of the fog of war, which is also kind of an odd, term when you're talking domestics, and the Second Amendment arguments, do you think that the tactics that are being implemented by ICE make sense?
Well, I need you to be a little more specific when you say that. Do the tactics make sense? What exactly is being done tactically on the ground that you would want me to weigh in on? Whether or not the operation in its entirety should be there, or how they're being deployed, or the weapons they're carrying? I don't understand.
Regardless of the Second Amendment and the fog of war that comes with a situation where there are riotous people, or there's firearms, or there's, whatever. Do you think the tactics that ICE are implementing make sense?
I am not going to levy an opinion on the employment or deployment tactics of DHS. I'm just not. I don't know enough about them. I don't know what the policy is, the posture, and the threat that they needed to mitigate. As far as the second portion of your, statement and opinion, I would imagine that there is always an optic with everything that a government does for and against its people. This is a very difficult event to look at objectively. It hits everyone a little bit differently. It hits many people directly at where they live in their community. I would, and I, at the risk of being accused of copping out and not answering the question, I feel that if you want to become a citizen of the United States, there's really only one right way to do it. And while people may plant their flag on the humanitarian aspect of illegal immigration in the United States, it still is, by its very definition, it's a violation of the law. Misdemeanor. Got it. Yep, you're right. Congratulations. Misdemeanor. If I commit a misdemeanor in the United States, I have to go before a judge, and there's typically a fine or potentially worse. You can have a misdemeanor driving offense and spend 30 to 60 days in jail. I just say this because I feel very strongly that if your introduction to the United States as a citizen is going to be day one breaking its law, that is the not harbinger of your interest, your desire to be a U.S. citizen. I don't know if the random way that DHS is enforcing U.S. laws is moral or ethical, because each one of us is going to come down on that a little bit differently. What I am mostly concerned with is it legal? I don't know. They are legally allowed to enforce the customs and border laws within the United States to the full extent of the law. And I mean, with the exception of these two shootings, and again, we'll let the chips fall where they may on those in a court of law. I don't think that anything they're doing is a breach of law. It is probably being wielded as a tool of propaganda in a certain sense. But, then again, we've had unchecked immigration for the last 30 years and have done nothing. We've abdicated every single time when enforcement has been brought up in Congress, in the administrations preceding this one. We've spent, since the Reagan administration, basically turning a blind eye towards unchecked immigration into the United States, illegal immigration. So I guess I can see both sides. There is a humanitarian aspect to this. There's a moral and ethical outrage to this, but there's also a cold, hard statistical fact that there's somewhere in the neighborhood between 15 million and 25 million human beings in the United States that have no legal right to exist here. And look, man, I know this is a digression once again, but forgive me. Saying that people can't be illegal is being childish and naive. Stop that. People can be illegal. If I went to Spain and I overstayed my visa, do you think that the Spanish government is going to put me up in a state-sponsored house and give me a stipend to live on and treat me with gentle cuddles? And no, they're going to call me illegally and they're going to kick me out of their country. I don't understand why when the U.S. does it, we're branded as, Nazis, but when every other country on the planet does it, they're just simply enforcing their border laws. Anyways, I went on my soapbox again. I try not to do that.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, it wasn't really. I mean, I don't have an opinion necessarily about the whole thing entirely, but just more curious, just about this is a whole new tactic of dealing with immigration. That
I think it is. It's more public. It's more visible. I grant you that. I absolutely grant you that. But again, I think the only counter that I have to that is not necessarily whether it's right or whether it's wrong, but I want everybody to just sort of look at it in the context of the last, almost 40 years when you really start to tabulate it, of this abdication of responsibility that we have to maintain border security. And now we're finally enforcing it, and it's ugly and it's messy. And yeah, it's probably a little bit for theater. I'll grant you that.
Yeah, I mean, we've always enforced it. It's just not in this same way. Like I said, starting out, previous administrations have deported a lot more people, and so, in that sense, illegal immigration has been policed.
But yes, but we've also never had the level of sanctuary cities that we have had today, that we've never had. We've never had the enforcement of employment not sanctions, but enforcing employment laws that are on the books. There's a lot of things that we have not done. Yeah, if you look at the totality of the last administration and even the one preceding that, not Trump's first administration, but the Obama administration, if you look at raw numbers, yes, they deported more, but you also didn't have as many coming in back then. I think you need to look at there's a lot of factors that go into this.
Sure, there always is.
And I'm sure that I'm going to be accused of being a heartless son of a bitch because I'm ignoring the human aspect of this, but you have to, in some respects. You're talking about statistics at this point.
For sure. I mean, and when you're talking about illegal, I do believe that if you are illegally in this country, that that's against the law, and that comes with a price. I do think that capitalism, and you look at the farming industry, and you start to look at labor costs, and you start to look at competing with, importation of, produce and other things that are coming from countries that, don't pay their people the way that we would have to in this country. And so you start to look at businesses that are hiring illegal immigrants, and they're hiring them for a reason. And that's so that their bottom line can look better. And why aren't we holding these people more accountable? Because I would feel like, especially in the in the world of agriculture, it is rampant. And it's seasonal, and everybody knows about it.
Yeah.
And then you start to look at trafficking children, and you look at the sex industry that's associated with that, and it just all of the things that are hot topics now. It's like, why aren't we going after the employers of these and holding them accountable? Because then there's no supply and demand when it comes to cheap labor and immigration, illegal immigration.
But I'm also sensitive. I'm also sensitive to the fact that there's a lot of industries that rely heavily on, a migrant workforce, and that's fine. I get that. We had programs in place to allow temporary work for these seasonal jobs, and I am of the belief that if you let the free market work unrestricted and unconstrained, that it will adjust and find homeostasis. Everyone has stated time and again, well, no American would work in the agricultural industry because of the conditions and the wage. Have we ever really put that to the test? And I am not a farmer in California. I am not a farmer in Iowa. I am not raising corn in Kansas. So please don't flame me. My point is this. I think if you allowed the free market, the flexibility and latitude to work, that void would be filled. And it may take a generation. It just might. We cannot, as a country, absorb the burden of 30 million people who may or may not be paying into the tax base, who may or may not be drawing from public benefits, who may or may not want to assimilate into the fabric and culture that is the United States. We just can't. And if you want to brand me as an elitist or a xenophobe or a jingoist, that's fine. Go for it. I think that is an extremely myopic viewpoint, though. This United States of 2026 is not the United States of 1880. We do not need a workforce to build railroads or to expand the Western frontier. What we need are high-tech jobs. We need medical, and we need those that come into the country to become an American citizen. It's my feelings anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. If you're going to come here and try to build a life here, you've got to do it legally. Otherwise, and when you start to talk about free markets, I mean, what do you think about, because that doesn't exist right now, especially with, all of these tariffs and everything and all of the posturing that's going on. Like, look at
Yeah.
Canada going to China, look at Norway going to China, and now, Trump is all up in arms about that. And you look
Yeah.
at the tariffs that he's implementing against, everybody and his brother. There is no free market.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, it's a complicated issue. It's probably going to take more time than you and I have in one sitting. So it's probably best to bookend this for the moment, and we can.
Yeah, we can move
Yeah.
on to something else for sure. It's just, I'm in full agreement, with a free market. I think that the world would be a much better place in a lot of ways, and that things would kind of shake out the way they needed to. And I do believe that you should be elite. Not that what I think really matters in any of this, but I do think that being legal is an important aspect to being an American. But
Yeah,
moving on
I think so too.
to something else. Is okay. Speaking of sanctions, let's go to Iran and look at how much do you think that the sanctions that we've implemented has caused the economic issues and led to the civilian unrest in Iran?
Yeah. I mean, I would probably say that it's not directly quantifiable, but if I was to, form an opinion, probably almost all of it. And not just the United States sanctions, but the package of sanctions that we have enlisted the global community to levy with us and sometimes on our behalf. But yeah, probably all of it, or at least a goodly portion of it.
And okay, there's also stuff being said about the CIA fomenting the protests and facilitating the uprise. What is your opinion on that?
I don't know as if I have an opinion. I mean, I love the fact that the people think that the CIA is all knowing and all seeing, but the fact of the matter is the Iranian people are feeling the effects of a collapsing economy in free fall. And that is something they're going to have to manage internally. They have gone down a path since the Islamic Revolution that took that country over. And that path has led to this. I don't think that the CIA is capable of causing a protest of this magnitude. I think they did that one on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that they're solely responsible if there's a presence at all, but if they've actually done something to help foment that at whatever capacity is all I was asking. So that being said,
I mean, I would not be surprised at all if they helped with certain vectors, but that's impossible for me to know definitively.
Okay, moving on in the same vein though with Iran, what do you think Russia will do in response if we go ahead with a strike on Iran?
What do I think Russia will do in regards to our influence in Iran, or our attack in Iran, or Iran period?
Our attack, like if we actually attack, do you think there'll be any ramifications?
I don't think they'll do anything. I don't think Russia is going to do anything. They're not going to lift a finger to help. The Russians maintain allies with countries, but they're not friends. It's transactional. Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, all that. It's just transactional. And if you think that is convoluted, you are clearly not drinking enough, because to me, it was crystal clear. almost as much as this Kettle One vodka is, which I have to confess is at the end of my glass, which means we're at the end of our show. I hope that you have learned a thing or two, perhaps opened your eyes on something you may not have been aware of, and if nothing else, I am entertaining. And until next week, I want all of you to think for yourselves and stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.